Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Sydney Rebecca.
And I'm Rebecca Snow.
And we're the Becks. So joining us for a very special episode is our editor, Keagan, because he's the one who introduced us to today's topic.
Hello. I edit.
Yes, he does.
He does a great job. So we are talking about another podcast today called Mallwalk. So for our younger viewers or listeners, if we have any, malls are these big stores that used to have little stores in them. And you could just walk around and shop all day. And they had food courts and activities like arcades and aquariums.
You could build a bear.
Yes, you could build a bear and buy Bath and Body Works and stuff.
And there's always hooligans.
Always.
Rapscallions.
Rapscallions. Yes.
And there's lots of people who would just walk around malls and do mall walk things.
And they were called mall walkers because that's what they did. They just walked the mall because there was lots of floor space that you could walk and get your exercise in or just wander for the heck of it.
Now, we don't have a mall around where we live. Not really.
We've never had a mall around where we live.
We've always had to travel a significant distance to get to a real mall. So that tells you how far up north and in the great northern tundra we are.
The cornfields are our malls. You get everything you need there. Corn.
Part of a nutritious and balanced breakfast. Sponsored by Kellogg's.
Hey. It's where it's all, right here. It's where it started. Cornflakes, baby.
So, Mallwalk is a podcast about a crime. It's about a pair of two friends who start off just wanting to do a mall walk, and it quickly devolves from there. Now, do we want to reveal that this is all fake?
I think, yeah, it's a good place to start.
It's set up like a true crime podcast. It's interview style. A host talks to various members of people who were
Witnesses, yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, to this crime that occurred.
And
tragedy. It's more of a tragedy. It's a horrible tragedy.
I would say borderline, like, terrorist attack.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah.
So, it follows Blair. He's kind of the main character. And he is best friends to Conrad, who is the perpetrator of the horrific crime that happens later on.
And they're 14-year-old boys.
Yeah, and this happens in 2004, which was like peak mall walk time.
I would say probably like the last time it could really happen where it didn't feel sad. I mean, 2010s is really when the mall started dying in America.
We can all blame it on Jeffrey Bezos.
Yeah.
So this all takes place in the Royal Galleria Mall in California, and it's like kind of the name suggests, it's like a medieval theme. There's moats, and all of the security guards are dressed up like knights, like cloth. It's like all sewn to look like knight's armor, and so there's a moat like with real water and real fish in it that goes throughout the whole mall, and there's a giant fountain in kind of this central location of the mall that's called the Crucible of Creation. And then everything kind of leads to, all the waterworks leads to kind of the main attraction of the mall, which is in the back. That's the aquarium, which houses various aquatic species, but of note, 2 hammerhead sharks.
2 sharks.
Yep.
Oh boy.
So there's a couple of things that I want to mention. So there's something very nostalgic about malls now, because we live in a society where they don't exist anymore, really. I mean, there's one a few hours away, but and I went in it recently because it had like a Sephora and I needed something out of a Sephora. And there's just tons of empty space in them. They're almost like there's something that's really big right now called liminal space horror.
Yeah.
And malls are kind of starting to encapsulate that a little bit, which I find interesting.
The only mall I've been to that I could still say is a mall is the one over on the west side of Michigan in Traverse City. That one still is thriving. Every space is open. There's a store in every space. It's kind of weird being there.
Yeah, it is strange because it's like now when I go into a mall, there's almost a level of expectation that it's going to be like almost nothing. And then going into a thriving mall, you sort of still get that same like nostalgia and like weirded outness that you get going into a dying one, because it's like it's uncanny almost. Like,
yeah,
like it shouldn't be happening as it is. And I think honestly a lot of Mallwalk really rests on the fact that malls can be seen as sort of this nostalgic, scary, melancholic place now, because they just are so few and far in between.
Yeah. And the melancholy is a huge thing in the podcast. It starts out talking about being melancholy and how you try to find the joy in the melancholy because they're always sad. These boys are dealing with mental health issues.
Mental health issues in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're really, I think they're each other's support system.
Yeah.
Like, they are the only things keeping each other stable and going, really, which is not safe when it's two 14-year-old boys.
Yeah, there's like a super high level of codependency between the two. So they talk, like the major themes, they talk about a lot about derealization. There's a lot of suicidal thoughts and ideation. Not just suicidal thoughts though, like, because I know when I first was diagnosed with depression, it wasn't so much, I wasn't at the point where I was like, oh, I want to die. It wasn't that I wanted to die, it was that I didn't want to exist at all. Right. Which is different. Like, what's the point of being alive is different than wanting to be dead.
For sure.
So there's aspects of that too, and then there's also some self-harm elements that they talk about with Conrad specifically.
Yeah. I think the thing that really struck me is how Blair described their names for feelings.
Mm.
Yeah, no, the writing on the description for feelings is incredibly detailed, and I think it's one of the better modern depictions of depression, because it puts words to things that I think a lot of people have trouble putting words to, but it also shows off another side of depression, which is intellectualization. The idea that if you can put a name to things and understand them, then you'll be better. But it doesn't make you better. It's just putting a name to it.
Yeah, it's like it's a flawed logic. You're like, okay, if I could just understand this, or like give it meaning, give it a descriptor, like something tangible, then you can ball it up and throw it away, or like you can compartmentalize it enough to where you can heal yourself.
Right. You're trying to think yourself out of mental illness, almost. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't work.
It doesn't. I mean, I think it can certainly help. Because, I mean, they even talk about how it's like, Blair specifically talks about how it's a way for his, like, in therapy, if you localize it, you can kind of, like, treat it in that way, and it can kind of help you step outside of your feelings a little bit. But if you step outside yourself too much, that's also an issue.
And I think Blair is a perfect example of that. I mean, he's someone who's so traumatized and so consumed by his emotions that he barely remembers his childhood or what happened after this huge traumatizing event.
Yeah, and he didn't speak for, what, 5 years?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's there was a line at the very beginning that I think really shows this. Like, the way they think just in general about themselves and the world. It was something like, when you've been sad for so long, you end up hating yourself. And when suddenly the whole world switches on you and they start to hate you too, it can kind of feel good because that means you were right.
100%.
Yeah, that was extremely, like, that hit me in the gut. It's like, oh, to think about, I know that you've dealt with severe depression, and as a mom, to hear those kind of things of your child, feeling that way, it's heartbreaking.
I think it's, because I've definitely been there. It makes it easier to detach, right? If you suck and everyone hates you. So if you make that the thing, and I think that it's great foreshadowing, sort of.
Yeah, for what's to come.
Yeah.
So, okay. Talk about. So, to kind of start us off, Blair talks about how the mall, like the entrance of the mall, is in a Kmart, which is also a super nostalgic a super nostalgic thing, because how many Kmarts exist? Like two?
There's
Two,
not,
three.
yeah, there's not many left. No.
Yeah.
And specifically, he talks about when he was a kid, how he got lost in Kmart, and there's a specific feeling that he experiences even now. It's the lost in Kmart feeling. And I actually got lost in a Kmart as a kid.
Oh boy.
Because we had one here in our town before it closed eventually.
You got lost in this one?
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Well, I was fucking 4 years old. I think I can be excused.
Well, you were tiny then, because you're tiny now, so I'm sure you could probably get up under one of those racks and be gone. But no one would have ever found you.
He talks about how, he was small and he was cold and he couldn't find anyone. It was like no one existed in the whole store. And he couldn't find his mom, and he just tried to go towards the blue light, because they always had the blue light special, right? If anybody listening remembers Kmart. And how they eventually did call his name over the PA because his mom was looking for him. And so he went up to the front and was reunited with his mom, but the feeling didn't go away. He still felt cold and alone and isolated. And that's the biggest thing about mental illness, right? Is that even if, like, you can say 100 times that, oh, you're not alone. People are just like you out there that feel the exact same thing. Mental illness is super isolating. That's what makes it so terrible.
Yeah, and I think that scene where he's describing that it's almost like, the seed of who he becomes. It really shows you, like, from a young age, the innate fear and just almost isolation and like rejection of the world he's living in. It's like there from the beginning, and it's a part of him, and it feels, all these things feel very just, he talks about everything in such a way that is so outside of himself. It's a really tough listen at points.
Yeah.
It is, very much.
100%. And that goes back to the codependency, too. Like, he and Conrad feel like they really, they talk about it. They talk about how, they name these feelings. And so it's like, okay, so they're not feeling them alone anymore. They're the only two people in the world who... Not that they're the only two people in the world that feel this way, but to them, it is like that. They talk about how, they can live outside the irony of, being stupid teenage boys while still experiencing it, and that's so real, right? Like, you always think that you're, like, everything's a facsimile, everything's a joke of a joke.
I'm above this, but I'm gonna do it because that's why it's funny.
Yeah, exactly. Like, the joke is that they know that it's a joke.
Yeah.
So they spend a long time talking about, in that first episode, they're on the escalator for a really long time. And I think it's almost like a metaphor for everything that's gonna come, because, not only did they talk about how Conrad's feeling because he's not a part of the Mallwalk yet. He's just talking about how people die horribly in escalator accidents.
Yeah.
Right.
Which I do want to bring up, too, because, like, I either know, like, I feel like every person I know talks about escalator accidents.
Oh, horrifying.
I forgot to tell Keagan.
Or, oh my god, okay, so something related, we'll bring it up in a second. Or, people are scared of escalators. So it's either I know somebody who knows about a horrific escalator accident, or they're scared of escalators. Which I've never had an issue with escalators, personally, until recently.
So I had told her about how you won't take an escalator because your fear is to, like, fall and get your hair caught and get scalped. Or,
Keagan has very long hair.
yes, and this and that. So, or your shoelace being untied and whatever.
Lose my foot. Yeah, no, thank you.
So we were at the conference. We had gone to a conference in Orlando, Florida a few weeks ago. For work. And Sydney went to get on the escalator ahead of me, and her shoe is completely untied. Like, long, and it's long.
They're really
Shoelaces,
absurdly long.
super long. And I'm like, oh my gosh, your shoe! So
the whole time I'm going up this fucking escalator like a flamingo.
she lifted her one leg and just stayed there.
And
I'm like, don't move!
And again, they're really long shoelaces, so I had to, like, really hold my leg up super high.
And that would have been, it definitely would have got caught. I don't think there would have been any way it wouldn't have gotten caught, because as long as those laces were, if you'd have set your foot down in that and it went flat, you'd have been, no.
So Keagan, why are you scared of escalators? Like, is it just, like, because of all the stories you've heard, or,
I think definitely the stories, but there's an amount of hubris that it takes to take something like stairs, which is something already humans die on all the time, daily, and then make them move. That is a level of hubris and cockiness that I can't subscribe to.
That's hilarious. I've never thought of it that way. Like, they're already dangerous, and now we're gonna make them they're gonna have teeth at the top too.
They're safer when they're off, because then they just become stairs.
Literally, when we went to Universal Studios, if any of you have been there are escalators everywhere to get into the park. You go up an escalator, then you go across another, and it's like the airport.
Yeah.
And we were there 5 days. We went 5 days in a row, and every single time, this kid who didn't exercise at all at the time walked up every single step because he was not getting on an escalator.
No.
It's like, okay.
Every time I go to the airport, I'm taking the elevators. It's a maze to find them half the time, especially in Detroit, but I'm taking the elevators. I'm not taking an escalator. I took one at Comerica up 3 floors and almost cried.
Aw. Oh, that's right. I forgot. That one was very big. Anyways, he was very brave that day. So
they're on this escalator, and Blair mentions it feels like they're on the escalator for a long time. I mean, they're going through several floors. It's the main way to get, up and down.
Yeah, to enter the mall, you have to go through Kmart, they said, correct?
Yep, and then but the main portion of the mall is the bottom floor, which has the food court, all of, like, the little shops. I call them little, but they're large in a mall. Like Forever 21, Bath and Body Works, Abercrombie Fitch, what's the entertainment one?
Oh, FYE.
Yeah, so all of those. And while they're on the escalator heading down, Blair sees his quest. He sees a girl. But the whole time Conrad is just focused on, he's like talking about all these horrific escalator accidents. And Blair mentions that it's a bad sign, right? So they go to the mall to have a good time, or as good a time as they can have, being two severely clinically depressed teenage boys. And they talk again, they talk about the pleasures of melancholy. So being sad, but in a meaningful way. And the fact that Conrad is talking about all these gory accidents and, you know, how horrific, all these horrific ways that people have died on escalators is a bad sign.
Yeah, a lot of foreshadowing goes on.
I think, especially in that moment, it's a good example of almost how I think Blair is selfish in a way. Whereas these Mallwalks keep him going. Sometimes it feels like Conrad's only there for him. He was so upset that Conrad was obviously, like, to me, if my friend's saying something that seemed off and deeply, darkly disturbing, I wouldn't be upset that he's harshing my vibe. I can't focus on this girl, my quest, or whatever. I'd be like, what's going on?
Yeah.
But to Blair, it was immediately like, why are you killing my vibe?
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely a note of that. And, because, I mean, even when Blair, like, focuses on this girl, who he's never met. She's a total stranger. And when he brings her up later on, Conrad's like, what the fuck are you talking about, dude? Like, because, I mean, at this point, I mean, look at it from Conrad's perspective. Like, he was in a dark place, obviously. He was letting off all these red flags, talking to his friend, hoping that his friend is listening. And then the whole time, like, later on, he realizes, oh, he wasn't listening to me at all. He was just focused on some random girl.
Yeah. And, like, hyper-focused. It had become all he could think about at that moment once he saw her because she smiled at him.
Yeah.
I think it's a tough situation when you have two people like that who both need the individual attention and support of other people. And when they try to support each other, you can get a sort of inherent selfishness that I think comes from more the need to survive than the need to, you know, just be happy or do whatever I want because I'm a selfish asshole. It's more like Blair was probably feeling close to what Conrad was feeling in his own way. And that quest, putting everything on that girl, I think was his way of coping with it.
And he even mentions that in hindsight, he put a lot on that girl who we later learn her name is Consuela. He puts a lot on her, and he even admits to talking about how people cease to be separate people, they become mirrors. So he's looking for something in Consuela. He doesn't care about her, right, like as a person. He cares about the idea of her and what she can show him about himself or tell him about himself.
Yeah. And it's almost like he's looking at most people as just transactions or what he can get out of them, which it's weird because usually that makes a character evil, vile, reprehensible. But here it's told so humanly that you almost don't notice.
Yeah, that's true. For sure. Because, you know, keeping in mind, Blair is the character that we hear the most from. We never get Conrad's perspective at all. We get Blair's, and we get a security guard, and we get various other people in the mall. But we never hear from Conrad. And so it's definitely... It's a one-sided feeling friendship, but he's you're right, it's just like a very human experience. And the whole time, he's a flawed narrator, but he's a sympathetic one.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you can definitely tell most of this it's not an accurate retelling more of somebody just venting their feelings. It's in more of an emotional, I feel like almost lashing out than a retelling of horrible events. Blair is he's so it's like he's a ball of contradiction at times. It's like he feels like exactly what he knows what Conrad should do, just focus on the Mallwalk, feel better, but also he can't help himself in almost any way.
Mm-hmm.
Solely relying on Conrad to even finish his whole point of his day, which is his mission.
Yeah, his quest for the girl.
And yet he tries to, and many times as he's retelling, he tries to make himself look like he was the one caring for Conrad. He had to leave the girl to go check on Conrad, and he couldn't leave Conrad alone in the bathroom for fear of what Conrad might do. But because, again, we don't hear from Conrad, we don't really know what Blair was doing or how Conrad felt. Conrad pushed him towards the girl. Was he doing that because he thought he was taking care of Blair? This is what he wants. I'm going to push him towards this because this is what he wants.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, again, they rely on each other so much. Like I said before, Conrad was talking about fucked up shit, throwing out flags, like probably not wanting to say that he wanted help or support from Blair, but, expecting it in a way. And then to find out later on again, like I said, like, who's this girl that Blair's talking about? Like, man, I was just telling you about stuff. I was just talking to you, and you're like, did you hear anything I said? But he internalizes it, right? He never brings it up. He never says a word against Blair until later on.
Yeah.
Right.
It's just interesting.
And even in those moments where you're like, oh, wow, they are really good friends. Like, there's moments where you do see the connection and what brought them together. But even those are, I feel like, subtly built on the rejection both of them are feeling at times. Mm. Like, this might be jumping ahead a bit, but when Conrad tells him to go see a movie with this girl, I feel like that was more of an, okay, yeah, this is what he wants, but he doesn't want me.
Mm.
It was less like, oh, I'm doing this for my buddy, and more like, my buddy couldn't give a shit about what I'm going through right now, so why the fuck is he even here?
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense.
And I mean, it's not the first time that Conrad kind of pushes Blair away. I don't think Blair ever saw it that way. Again, like, it's all from Blair's point of view, but even when Blair, like, tried to follow Conrad into the bathroom, Conrad was like, you gonna help me aim? Like, fuck off.
Right.
Yeah. Like, so it kind of felt, in a way, with, like, the context clues that we get later, that Conrad was, like, telling Blair to kind of fuck off a little bit. Like, are you gonna care or aren't you? Yeah. Because we went through all this shit on the escalator, you didn't hear any of it, and now you're gonna follow me into the bathroom? Like, shut up.
He broke down and was crying on his knees, and all Blair could think about was the girl.
Yeah, so when they get off the escalator, he talks about how you're in line at Orange Julius, so they get drinks, and they get out of the way of the escalator and the line of people at Orange Julius, and they see the carousel, which is also medieval themed like everything else. And Conrad spends a long time staring at it, and then he finally just breaks down and gets on his knees and starts crying. And
that would have, as a friend right there, that would have been my cue to not leave my friend, no matter what.
Yeah.
The quest, as I'm air quoting, the quest, this girl that he was so focused on should have been left behind at that point. And
Blair was concerned, but he mostly, he dragged Conrad away. He, like, admits to this because, people were staring, and Conrad finally threw his drink at the carousel, and that's when Blair was like, okay, we need to get the fuck out of here. But I don't think he ever asked Conrad, like, hey, what's going on? Or, like, are you okay? And again, it could have been, a symptom of their friendship, right? That they didn't do that. That they just kind of, like, let it go or whatever. But
Yeah. But I think it's interesting because I don't know if he mentions if this. I feel like he does say something about this being like a unique instance. Like usually it didn't get to the point where there was a breakdown like that.
True.
And I mean, even if he didn't say that, I feel like these two people obviously, cutting is a way to take control. Putting all of your expectations and emotions onto somebody else and projecting all of that, that's, again, a way to control. You don't feel what you're feeling at that moment. So it's to have a full breakdown like that for people who are seemingly so obsessed with being in control of their emotions at all times.
Yeah.
It maybe they are in control of them, but sometimes they're not truly like in touch with them. You can physically restrain yourself from doing things at times, but sometimes you do just feel that. Yeah, I think that was a big part where Blair could have stepped up, but I think he's too far gone to be able to.
Yeah.
And again, it's when it gets harmful, right? I mean, like, that's why codependency is like a thing that if it's bad enough, you also have to go to therapy for. Because you can't rely on one person for anything ever. I'm not trying to be cynical here, but like legitimately you cannot make one person the hinge on which your sanity rests. Whether it's, because you're a happy person or you're a sad person. One person, you can't do that to someone. And how would it feel if in your shoes if someone was that reliant on you?
Yeah.
Humans are flawed. They need their own space. They need their own, like, that's why therapists are great, because you can just fucking dump your shit on them. It's their job. So you don't do that to your friends. But it's something that, Blair obviously didn't have the bandwidth for, maybe ever, but especially at that Mallwalk. But he was desperate for, the pleasures of melancholy, as he says. So instead of aborting it all, like, instead of being like, hey, maybe we should just go home and cry. I know you just had a very public mental breakdown and almost got us kicked out. We're just going to keep doing our thing, right?
Right. I'm still going to go for it. Because again, I truly think these are two people at their lowest. And that the yearning for connection, I think was big for Blair. And I feel like he didn't know how he was going to hang on. And so he needed that.
Yeah.
I also think it's interesting you brought up them almost getting kicked out for that. Because, the security guard, when he's being interviewed in it, he does say, if I had just not been distracted by the parents or whatever he got distracted by, I could have kicked those kids out. None of this would have happened.
Yeah.
There's never a point in which anyone says, what's wrong with Conrad? Like, how are we going to help this kid?
No, instead it's just like, how are we going to
save everyone else?
Yeah. It's not about saving Conrad. Because, spoiler, Conrad is never to be seen again after everything that happens. He disappears, whether he drowns or, whatever. His body is never found. He's never heard from again, etc. He is never someone that is talked about through the whole series, very pointedly, I would say, where they're like, oh, we could have saved Conrad. It's never about that.
What could everyone have done differently to... Yeah, okay, so you see this kid on his knees crying and he throws a drink at the carousel. No one cared that a 14-year-old boy was on his knees sobbing. Not one parent stepped up.
Yeah, and even the security guard said, he was like, oh, I thought maybe he'd gotten broken up with or something, but not really my problem. He shouldn't have been throwing drinks.
As an adult, I would hope, and as a mother, I would hope that if either one of my children were in that kind of predicament, that another adult would walk up and say, are you okay?
Yeah.
What can I do to help you? But that goes to show what what our world is now, people will stay right out of it too. And again,
the bystander effect, right?
Yeah.
Somebody else will deal with
right
it.
back to we fail everyone when it comes to mental health.
Yeah.
I really think the only mention of parents in the whole thing, I think there's 2 mentions, and it's when Blair gets lost in Kmart, and in that scene where they're talking about the carousel, because it's Conrad remembering his mother taking him to the carousel when he was a kid.
Yeah.
So in these moments, parents are only ever connected to sadness.
True.
And they are, I mean, they never even say, like, how their parents felt about this situation, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, you'd think that, parents get interviewed after tragedies all the time. You'd think that Conrad's parents would have
said something.
Yeah. And again, it's all, this is all fiction. It's fake true crime, if you will. But it is interesting. Parents are one of those entities that are like, either people lay all the blame on them or they lay all the blame on themselves. And so them only being connected to sadness, and even after Blair, for example, even after Blair's mom is able to locate him in Kmart, she never fixes the feeling. So is she worth mentioning again?
Right. And what I like about Blair and Conrad in that instance is the 2 instances of their parents. One feels horribly neglectful. That scene in Kmart, children get lost in stores all the time, but the way he describes it, it was almost like
there was
nobody. Like he was left in a store past the time he should have been.
Abandoned,
left, forgotten. But for Conrad, the memory of being with his mother on a carousel was such a joyous memory that to someone who's depressed, it hurts, right? Because you can never achieve that again, or so you think. So it's sort of this dichotomy of this one might have neglectful parents, and this one might have parents who made their whole world, but at the end of the day, they're still basically mirrors of each other emotionally.
Yeah. So it's kind of at this point, so they run from the security guard, they buy shitty disguises, they get hoodies, and makes them look shadier, which, that's such a teenage thing to do. Like, not only did they think that this security guard was gonna hunt for them, which as soon as they were gone from it, the security guard even says in his interview, he's like, no, I forgot about them. The only reason why I remembered them is because of what happens later on. So they think that the security guard is going to hunt for them, and then they think that the solution is that they just purchase one article of clothing and put hoods up and look even sketchier.
Yeah. You can't see me.
Yeah. Like, if my hood's up, I'm gone. So they keep walking through the mall, and at this point, this is when, after they buy the hoodies, which I do want to bring up, Blair talks about how, so the hoodies are, it's a Nightmare Before Christmas hoodie, which Conrad takes for himself because it's in November, it's between Halloween and Christmas, says it's perfect. Blair takes the Tinkerbell one, and he says, if you don't believe in me, I'll disappear. Which I think is just another kind of, like, interesting look into Blair's psyche.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Blair is completely detached from himself as a person. He doesn't know who he is, and he doesn't know how to be anything anymore. He's and really the whole podcast really encompasses that. Even with the soundtrack, the loud, droning, like, just noises at points, it really feels like almost a dissociative episode where you're just, everything's fuzzy, you're not you. And then the mall soundtrack that's sort of just always right behind you and far away and distant. It's like that, if you could just get there, right? If you could just, it's so far. And it feels like the whole thing is sort of set up to make the point that Blair is outside of himself, and also I feel like make the audience member in a way feel like that.
It's very effective. Like, the sound design of this podcast is so good.
Everything about this podcast is so good.
It's really good.
It's really something that we're talking about because all three of us fucking love this. But it's something that you have to experience on yourself, like, for yourself. It's
Keagan just happened to stumble upon it.
Yeah.
Good old TikTok.
Yeah. And he came to Sydney and I and said, hey, would you consider covering another podcast for your podcast? Which I thought was a weird idea at first. And,
hey, we're multimedia.
But yeah, so, and it is, I mean, there are horror elements in this, definitely. It's disturbing and terrifying, and it's real life horror, like, even though it's not a real story per se.
Well, this is the thing, right? And this is something that even the podcast talks about, is how, like, life imitates art imitates life, all that stuff. Like, yeah, this particular tragedy hasn't happened, but how many, let's just think for a second, like, how many of these crimes and these tragedies and these terrorist attacks, however you want to categorize them, how many of them happen because of mentally ill boys? I mean, specifically, I'm not saying that, all crime happens by mentally ill boys, but it's a huge number. It's like an epidemic.
It's large.
Yeah, and, nobody has nobody, like, we have the resources, but we don't want to put any money into it, and we don't want to put any time into it. And so it's all like, it's like a huge lesson, or kind of just a spotlight on from start to finish, like, what could we do to have prevented this? And it starts with one person. It always starts with one person. And that's the hard thing, because it seems like it would be really difficult, but it's always down to helping that one person. And in this case, it's Conrad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you could akin Conrad to someone like the Unabomber almost. Someone so forgotten and not cared about in society that they decide to lash out in whatever way they want. And if you want to condemn them for that, you have every right to.
Yeah.
But it doesn't change the fact that there's probably something underlying going on there. Yeah. No one sends bombs in the mail because.
No. I think I'll do that today. Yeah. No, that's not how it works.
Yeah. No, and it's at times it's like, you really, again, it's all from Blair's perspective, but there's times where the pain that you can glean that Conrad is feeling is so acute. It's honestly, like, I think both me and Becky cried the first listen through.
Oh, I did.
Like, the end of episode 4 specifically was really hard.
Yeah.
We're probably going to do multiple episodes, probably 2 whole episodes on this, because there's just a lot to cover, so I don't want to get too far ahead. There's lots of narrative coincidences that happen so naturally that it's kind of fascinating. So we get introduced to a man named Robert, and his niece is the one that talks about this, because he was older when this happened, so he's probably dead by the time they recorded this. But he has dementia. He's an older man, and his niece takes him to the mall because it's a nostalgic place for him. He used to work there. So you get another kind of aspect of that nostalgia. And nostalgia is interesting because it's not a bad feeling, but it's not a wholly good feeling either. I think it really links into that pleasures of melancholy, right? Because you're remembering something and you can never experience it again.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is...
And with him, he's longing for what is no longer.
Yeah.
As many dementia patients go through, obviously, because that's all they remember is back.
Yeah, and they're just out of their time.
Yeah.
And it's deeply tragic, and that's something that happens every day.
Yep.
Everyone knows someone or knows someone who has to deal with dementia, or similar diseases like Alzheimer's, and how it kind of weaponizes your own mind against you.
Yeah, for sure.
In ways that are different from like what Conrad and Blair go through. But he's an important player because Robert gets aggravated at some point during his niece's Mallwalk, and he runs into the food court and like starts harassing the girl working at A&W, and he's like, "Where are my boys? Like, where's my crew?" And she, of course, doesn't know has no idea what he's talking about. It's just this random man, and
asking why everything's different.
Yeah, and these boys who are also introduced to, they're a bowling team called the Pinheads.
The Pinheads. I love that.
They are a bunch of assholes, and they're pissed because they just lost their bowling match or whatever, so they decide to make nuisance of themselves and mess with this fucking old man with dementia, which is really fucked up, okay?
Yeah, that is.
Like, this made me mad. And they're like, "Oh, it's us, we're your boys. Like, the mall burned down, that's why everything's different." And he's like, "Well, where's my Robert?" The old man is like, "Well, where's my best girl?"
She was supposed to meet me here after work.
Yeah, she was supposed to meet me, and they're like, "We'll find her." And that's when the Pinheads and Robert, Consuela, Blair, and Conrad all collide. And Robert, they point the girl out. The Pinheads point the girl out to her. She's just sitting like by the fountain, the Crucible of Creation. It's like a giant fountain. It's got like light works, and like the way they describe it is like it's supposed to be lit up like fire.
Yeah, the descriptive narrative in here is amazing. Like, I was seeing the arcade and the moat, and I wanted to go there so bad.
You could see the shittily painted murals of castle walls.
Yeah.
No, you could really feel it.
You could smell the food court. Like, it's very immersive.
Yeah.
So the Pinheads, they run up to Consuela, who's just sitting there minding her own business, and they're like, "Hey man, that's your best girl. That's her." And Robert's like, "Consuela, why didn't you meet me? Like, you lied." He's upset, and Consuela's like, "What the fuck is going on?" And it's actually her name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so she gets scared, and she just keeps saying, "I don't like this. I don't like this," because, of course,
it's just a random old man.
You've got this old man that's trying to grab you.
And there's a bunch of boys who are laughing.
And encouraging him.
And Blair gets shoved forward by Conrad. He's like, you better go rescue her. That's the implication.
Right. And it makes you wonder if, again, I think that's a moment that's supposed to stand out as, we're friends. Mm. This is what friends do for each other. They tell each other to go get the girl, go be a man, stand up. This is your moment. Or was it Conrad pushing more people away, saying, "All right, there you go. There's your chance. Go take it. You don't need me."
Yeah.
Yeah.
It kind of makes you wonder, like, I do wonder if the whole time Conrad is, because the point of the podcast is kind of his, or I shouldn't say the point, the climax of the podcast is Conrad fucking losing it and destroying some property that causes drownings and maulings and horrible deaths. Is at this point, is Conrad just pushing Blair away because he thinks that's what Blair wants, or is he putting out more red flags? Is this another plea for help?
And honestly, I think it could almost be seen as both, because there is, that's a tricky one, because there is, sort of this, I think when you're depressed, you do understand that people outside of you are yearning for stuff, and while you want their help and would, to some extent, need their help, you feel like you're in the way. But at the same time, there's always, I find, an inherent jealousy with depression too, because you sort of assume you're not good. And when people choose something over you, that's, again, another sign you're not good. And it feeds back into that sort of, then your brain rewards you because you were right, you're not good.
Gives you that validation of, I was right.
So you're seeking validation from a negative, like, response loop rather than actual people. And I think Conrad was so, where Blair seemed so detached and so, like, if I can just find something to distract myself, I'll be okay. Conrad is so retreated within himself that his emotions are the only thing he can experience. And I feel like they're really at the driving wheel of who Conrad is.
Yeah. It's like he's trapped inside this negative feedback loop with no escape. There's no one to pull him out of it. Whereas Blair is outside of his own self. You know, he is watching himself experience things. He's not directly experiencing things.
Yeah. Which I think is why he's such a good narrator. Because it's almost like he wasn't there.
Yeah. Yeah. In a lot of ways. It's totally true. So there's a confrontation. I think, you know, one of the pinheads shoves Blair and Conrad actually does get involved. And that's when one of the pinheads is like, show us your tattoos, and pulls up his sleeve. And that's when, you know, Blair mentions that his arms are all cut up.
Yeah, Conrad's arms are.
Now, okay, so I am kind of curious, like, because obviously I knew what it meant as soon as, like, they talked about how his arms were scratched up, and there were some that were fresh and some that weren't, and, you know, whatever. But I do wonder if if it's obvious to, like, a casual listener that Conrad had self-harm marks on him. Like, when you first heard it, Becky, was that immediately you were like, oh, he cuts himself?
Oh, yeah, for me, but I have also dealt with family members that have cut themselves.
Gotcha.
So, not in my immediate family, but I have nieces and stuff that have been through that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I knew that that's what they were reaching for when they were trying to call him out, which was sickening. I would slap those kids.
Yeah.
That part is really kept intentionally vague.
Yeah.
And it almost makes me question, like, what the point in that is. It does, I don't know, it does feel like, oh shoot, it does feel like they're trying to
good thing you can edit it.
Yeah. keep the heavier bits of information sort of maybe out of the range of people who haven't experienced that yet. The tattoo scene, to me, I think, because I think he does call them scars then, right? Or does he ever?
I can't remember.
I think that might be the big reveal moment, having it all up and down the arms. But yeah.
Well, and revealing that when he was in the bathroom earlier.
Yeah.
That's why Blair didn't want to leave him alone, because that's what he was doing, was cutting.
Yeah, Blair never comes out and says it. He says it's not a good idea to let Conrad go to the bathroom by himself when he's in boots like that. And that's all he kind of says. And again, I think it's something like, unless you know, you're not going to catch it immediately. Like, unless somebody explains it to you or what have you. So, you know, the niece is able to pull Robert away eventually. You know, Conrad's a big dude. He doesn't take that lying down. He doesn't take, you know, he's pissed. He's a big dude. They, you know, chase the pinheads off, and then it's just the three of them. It's just Conrad.
Yeah, Blair had come to the rescue of Consuela. He stepped up and tried to fight, even though he was the smaller of the two. And so he was...
Skinny punk kid.
Yeah, he was stepping in to be that Prince Charming. he'd come to the pinnacle of his quest.
It was his hero's journey.
Yeah.
This was it.
This is where he rode in on his white horse and his...
I think this is another kind of glimpse into, like, Blair's hubris. Because it's fucking absurd to me that anyone ever thinks of themselves as, like, a hero and, somebody else. I mean, yeah, he did step in to stop a sick old man from yelling at Consuela. But I guess as the audience, we know she wasn't in any danger, but they don't, right?
Yeah.
Like, I guess Blair, it could be argued that Blair and Consuela and Conrad, they didn't know that she wasn't in any real danger, but it was just, she wasn't in any actual danger, and for Blair to be like, hell yeah, I did it, it kind of smacks of just, like, come on, dude.
I think that is down to maybe an idealized version of what life can be when you're that young, and when you are that depressed genuinely at that age. I think you don't know what reality is at some point. So
yeah.
To be able to think, oh, I could be that knight in shining armor. I could save that girl and we could live happily ever after. That's an option that's here and it's on this table. You really will justify and do anything to get that, because it's the only thing you could think of, right, that is outside of the sadness.
Yeah.
And at the age of 14, too, for boys and girls, everything is life and death.
Yeah. We've talked about that before.
There's no tomorrow. It's right now, that gratification, that everything is, you just can't see.
So serious.
Yes, you can't see that what's going on right here, right now, that's not always going to be right here, right now. But it feels like it.
Yeah. And I think it's funny, too, especially at this point, because Blair talks about specifically how the media, after everything that happened, they blame the video game. They blame that it was a castle video game on, the coincidence of, the mall being like a castle and Conrad acting the way he did. When Blair does the same thing, he's the knight in shining armor and she's the princess or the damsel that he has to save. He's just as, like, caught in the delusion of the medieval mallscape as Conrad was.
Yeah.
At times.
I think, yeah. And I think that's why, there's a lot of coincidences, and that's why it was, deflected what he did in the media, because it's easier to blame a haunted video game or something like that than it is to say there was someone who was sick and
needed help.
Yeah, and we didn't get him the help that he needed, and we let it get too far.
Yeah.
And it is really, it's almost like they're playing the lives they think they should be, right? Sort of Blair following this sort of generic hero's quest path, and Conrad going down literally the exact opposite.
Yeah.
It's they're both trying to obtain what they want, really.
Yeah.
In this sort of idealized setting.
And it makes you wonder, too, based on, Blair also kind of getting caught in the medieval castle aspect of it. Like, so if he was the hero and Consuela was the damsel that needed saving, who was the overarching villain, right? Because they were you deal with the villain throughout the whole journey, right? So was the villain, not that he wanted to admit it, but was the villain, like, his friendship with Conrad or Conrad himself?
That's a good point, because I think maybe that's not how Blair saw it, but I think you can make a really good point that that's exactly how Conrad saw it.
Yeah.
That he was the guy in the way.
Yeah.
And he just needed to go. And for someone who, again, is so controlled by emotion and driven by emotion, the feeling of rejection and the feeling of being a nuisance those are the two biggest things you're trying to avoid, right?
Yeah.
And I think in that moment of sort of seeing his friend achieve something that he would probably also like to achieve, and being what he considers to be the roadblock in his friend's way, there's probably a mixture of self-hatred and jealousy.
Yeah.
And I think it would definitely lead him to just completely push away the one person he had.
Yeah. And once, the smoke is cleared, so to speak, and Consuela is talking to Blair, because she doesn't talk to Conrad. Conrad's like, hey, Blair loves horror movies. Like, you guys should go see the new Grudge movie. And,
yeah, because that's why she was there, was to see that movie.
Yeah, and Blair was like, what do you mean, man? Like, shut the fuck up, Blair. You didn't want Conrad to go on your movie date. Like,
Yeah.
Are you that delulu? Like, literally, when Blair was recounting that, I'm like, my guy, no one in this audience right now is believing that you wanted your best friend to go to the movies with you and this girl you just saved. Like, Consuela didn't want him there. You didn't want him there. Conrad, frankly, didn't want to be there.
Right.
And that's why for multiple reasons, but that's why he was like, no, you kids have fun. I'll be at the arcade.
And I think, again, like, that is they're here to be together. That's the whole point. Like,
Yeah.
They do this together. This is what they do.
What it was to make them feel better as they could feel.
And you have Conrad, he's having a hard time on that escalator. He's telling Blair these dark fantasies. He's going into the bathroom to cut himself. He's throwing his drink at a carousel. And, they're supposed to be there together, and not for even a second is Blair really thinking about Conrad.
Yeah.
He is always demanding when Conrad is not doing exactly what he wants and acting exactly how he wants, that they focus on the Mallwalk, that the vibe change, that the air change in the room. And the moment he gets what he gets, it's like, oh yeah, man, you sure you don't want to come? All right, bye.
Yeah. No, and Blair even mentions, he's like, on the escalator at the very beginning, he's like, oh shit, he's talking about dark accidents. This isn't how I wanted this Mallwalk to go. This isn't how I wanted this Mallwalk to go. It's like, okay, but like, your friend is suffering.
His friend was screaming for help in every way he could have.
Yeah.
And really, the thing is the whole Mallwalk was supposed to be for Conrad.
Mm-hmm.
Blair was supposedly seeing how awful his friend was doing and was reaching out. And that's why he's a good narrator when it comes to description, but when it comes to telling maybe the truth, I feel like he's very bad at it. Because that at times the Mallwalk feels like the entire thing has been centered around Blair since the very beginning.
Yeah, he's super unreliable. And I know we're kind of dogging on Blair, like,
but
and we have been. But yeah, it's like, he's a very sympathetic person. But, as people who have listened to this a few times and are kind of dissecting it and talking about it now, it's like, he's an extremely flawed person, and he's not, he's not as much of a hapless victim as other people in this story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I don't think at any point he takes any responsibility or shows any remorse of what his part of this is. Not that he has to take responsibility for what his friend chose to do.
Right.
But at every step that we took with them in the mall, Conrad was begging his friend to notice. He was doing everything possible other than screaming, "Hey, fucker, I'm going to lose my mind, and I don't know what to do anymore."
He even, like, Blair even recognizes on the escalator that the feeling that he thinks that Conrad is feeling is the kill everyone feeling.
Right.
Yeah.
Bro, like, what do you mean?
Yeah, and he just never...
And you're not going to stay with your friend and help him through that. Like, arrange a different day for the date with Consuela. Like, it's not that hard. You're there for your friend.
And he even says at one point in the beginning where he would like to say that wasn't, that day, that wasn't who Conrad really was. But he always knew.
And he'd seen signs.
He'd seen signs. And he never reached out for help for his friend.
Yeah. There is something at the very end, I probably won't mention because it's probably going to be more the second part of this. But Blair, I think he thought Conrad would be fine because Blair assumed they felt exactly the same. Mm-hmm. That maybe the big empty feeling he was hiding from was also the one Conrad was hiding from. And that, you know, he probably wouldn't feel that bad if this was the situation was reversed. I really think he thought because he was incapable of that rage, that he could make the right decision not to harm others, that his friend could do that too, without him. And again, maybe it's not all on Blair, but he's the one who put Conrad in this environment.
Yeah.
On a day when he obviously knew he couldn't handle it.
Yeah. Or that Blair really needed to take the time and the attention to try to help Conrad climb out of it.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't, like, they talk about all these feelings and they never talk about liking any of the feelings unless it's the pleasures of melancholy. So the whole time they're trying to reach that. They're trying to climb out of the other feelings. And Blair is trying to climb out of those other feelings. And he gets to during this Mallwalk. You know, he puts it all in Consuela and he's like, okay, this is great. He doesn't extend a hand to Conrad in this particular Mallwalk. And he feels like he did.
Yeah.
He's like, well, and it's another case of him saying that people are mirrors, right? Conrad stopped being Conrad and instead became a mirror of Blair.
Right.
And that's where he failed his friend, ultimately. So, they go to the movies. Blair and Consuela, they go to see The Grudge. Great movie, by the way. And Conrad splits up with them and he goes to the arcade. Real quick, I just want to mention they don't make it very far into the movie before Consuela and Blair start making out.
Yeah, it was pretty quick. And they had just met.
But, I mean, 14.
Yeah, whatever. Exactly. He got his conquest. He was there where he wanted to be. So.
Yeah. Blair talks about how in the opening sequence of the Grudge, it opens with Bill Pullman's character, and he's on a balcony, and his wife wakes up, and
I just listened to this on the way home.
Yeah, we've all been re-listening to this,
yeah,
because it's so good. It's like the re-listenability of it is excellent. But his wife or his girlfriend or a woman wakes up, and she's like, "Oh, you're awake! Like, what's going on?" And Bill Pullman just tilts himself off the balcony and falls to his death. And Blair talks about how, it's kind of a chilling scene, it's meant to be scary, it is scary. But he also talks about how it looked easy.
Yeah, and he wondered if that could be him.
To die like that.
Mm-hmm. He
wondered if he would die as easy.
I think that's a great example of sort of Blair and Conrad, to me, they're almost like personifications of like passive suicidal ideation and active suicidal ideation. Someone who yearns to die but can't bring themselves to put it into action, and somebody who has finally crossed that barrier where they are fully planning and are going to act out some level of violence against themselves.
Yeah.
And with again Blair, I think, assuming that people are mirrors, he could never really grasp, I think, the rage Conrad was feeling, the thing that could lead him down that path.
So there's other coincidences I want to talk about. So the third episode is when they're at the movie theater and Conrad starts playing Entranto. And Entranto is like the overarching like specter of this whole podcast, because like Blair said, early on, the media blamed the video game for how Conrad acted. And Entranto it's in an arcade cabinet. It's a side scroller. It's like an action adventure, but there's like horror elements. They actually, in the podcast, they bring on and interview another person who, it's like the only other person in the world who played Entranto, because it's like there was only like 5 made. It was very rare.
And they're all lost. They can't find anywhere.
The story of Entranto is really similar to the creepypasta of Polybius.
Polybius, yeah, I was trying to fucking think of the name of it. It kind of, and the, like, the descriptions of Entranto when they were talking about it reminded me a lot of, like, Castlevania.
Yeah.
So if y'all have ever heard of Castlevania, it's really infamous. I don't know if it was ever an arcade cabinet, but
I think it might have been. I think at one point they made at least a couple.
Yeah. If it didn't start in an arcade, it probably ended up in an arcade cabinet at some point, because it was just one of those games. But the opening of this game says, Conrad, never to be wed.
Mm-hmm.
Poor Conrad, never to be wed. Poor Isabella, chased by Manfred. So at the very beginning of the game, Conrad dies. He's like the groom. This little sprite character is killed. And the player character plays as his wife or his fiancé. And she's being chased throughout this castle by a king. And she's trying to find the escape.
Yeah. And this game is also, apparently it's known for being incredibly hard. In fact, of the people who have memories or who have been known to actually play Entranto, no one had beaten it.
Yeah.
The creator of this game, incredibly elusive, made like 2 video games, disappeared off the face of the earth.
Yeah, he was like a teacher. He did, right, because they were talking about like the Romantic era. He was like he was a teacher who studied Romantic literature.
And the Romance era. And Entranto is actually, I think they say it in the podcast. It's named after the first like romance book.
Yeah.
Because like the Romance era was just like reliving, what was it, the Victorian era or something, like an era before that.
Yeah, it was like nostalgia.
Yeah, it was like nostalgia.
Yeah.
And the whole thing was this, Entranto the book is supposed to be like it's a lost manuscript. That the guy who actually wrote it and published it during the Romance period found. That's the whole thing. He didn't write this book. He found it and just published it. Well, it turns out that was a lie. But it was really the first big romance novel and one of the first, like, pieces of, like, found media, almost.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like the history of that almost ties into the baseline of some horror genres.
Yeah. It's crazy how much of a difference something like that can have on everything. I mean, we talked about it in our Frankenstein episode. Like, literally, Frankenstein is the basis of so many stories. It can all be traced back. And in a similar vein, Entranto being that first romance novel, I mean, the genre, the nostalgia of it. It was huge. It lasted many years.
Yeah.
And it's still, like, I mean, we study it in college, you know? Like, people are still obsessed with it.
That's the era when art got good. I mean...
yeah. Like, it was interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it's... Entranto has a lot of base in media in general. And I think picking something so vital to that and sort of like... sort of reflecting... It almost reflects the narrative of the podcast itself, and it's wild to me, something so old and so like base to a lot of works being put into something so modernized.
Yeah,
it's really interesting. But so the game is like Castlevania, and the whole thing is what? It was subliminal. They think there's subliminal messages in it.
Yep, the old subliminal messages telling him to kill everybody in the mall. Yep.
Yeah. So eventually, Conrad, people start noticing him in the arcade because he's getting angry.
Getting pissed.
He's like bashing on this thing.
Yeah, it's hard. You know, he can't win, and he starts to think that the point of the game is to die. Yeah,
because Blair comes out to check on him, like halfway through the movie. He says he's going to get more popcorn or something.
He goes to get a cherry Coke.
Right, and he goes to check on him, and Conrad says, I figured it out, man. There's no way to win this game, but you can choose how you die.
Yeah.
And...
If that's not a fucking just a common thread of how people feel about real life, though.
Yeah.
Like, how can you win at life? Like, real life, how can you win? You can choose how you die, though.
Yeah.
It's not a nice thought to have, but it's a common one, especially for people with mental illness. I would feel.
I feel like, especially with somebody who has such complex mental illness like Conrad. Death can feel like the only thing you have control over. Mm. You don't have control over your emotions or your body or sometimes even your own thoughts. But you can control whether you die.
And, at this point, he's talking about the video game. But, while Blair is talking to him, he dies. And this is another moment where you kind of see the disconnect in Conrad and Blair's relationship. It's a little more heavy-handed than the other instances in the podcast. But Blair's, Conrad gets pissed. He gets killed by something, like a specter or whatever. And he's like, fuck, he's pissed. Blair's like, what is wrong? I thought that's what you wanted. And he's like, no, you haven't been listening. I have to kill myself. And I'm not in the right spot in the game. I need to be further down.
I haven't even found the trap door.
Yeah, I haven't even found the trap door.
He needs to... How does he say... Where does he want to die again? He wants to die where the water flows up?
Where the water flows up, and is it the cellar?
Yeah.
The lower level cellar or something like that where the water flows up.
I have to die in the cellar where the water flows up. Yeah, and that, again... it'll probably be touched on in the next episode, but that is one of... I'd say probably the biggest coincidence that they throw. It's sort of one that's so overt, it's going to slap you in the face. And what I like about that is there are so many elements that they want you to make, they want you to feel like maybe it's a ghost, maybe it was the government, maybe it was
it's something in the fucking Orange Julius.
Yeah, they're just trying to... Everyone is trying to convince themselves that it was anything but Conrad.
Well, and they even state, some of the people they talked to that played the game or whatever, the one complained about it did something to his eyes.
Her eyes.
Yeah,
it was one, they found one other player.
Yep.
And she said that it messed with her eyes. When Conrad starts freaking out, there's a guy from a pinball, he does it professionally. He's a competitor. There's a good rare
hero.
There's a good cabinet So he like sees Conrad, and I mean everybody at the arcade becomes aware of Conrad because he's fucking swearing and he's yelling and he's
shaking the machine.
Yeah. Eventually, like, people go over to try, like, so Blair leaves. He goes back to finish the movie, which, again, like, his friend was freaking out over a fucking video game. And Blair was like, you know what? This is not my problem right now. I'm gonna go back to the nice place where I was making out with that girl.
With the pretty girl, yeah.
And he just leaves him.
Just leaves.
Knowing he's upset. Knowing he's talking about all this craziness.
Saying what amounts to, like, nonsense, almost.
Yeah.
Like,
it's like, it's the slip grip feeling, right? Like, it's watching his friend fucking devolve into a state where, like, either someone needs to forcefully get Conrad out of, or, like, it can't happen by himself. Like, Conrad needs help, and Blair just, he has his blinders on. Either he doesn't want to admit it, or he admits it, but ignores it.
Right. And I think a lot of the podcast is him almost trying to convince himself that he didn't notice. But he tells on himself right away that he knew it was in Conrad. So no matter how much he sort of tries to maybe shift the blame on a video game or on any other instance besides just him ignoring his friend going through a bad time, it feels like, honestly, just a massive cope.
Yeah.
It feels like he knew on some level he was responsible, and that because he failed so uniquely, he has to rationalize any other reality in which he wasn't at fault.
Yeah, he wasn't culpable in some way.
Do you think that's why he retreated afterwards and didn't speak for 5 years? Because he just couldn't mentally deal with what he took as his responsibility? I mean, he still never admits it throughout the whole thing, but was it his way of just, because he couldn't deal with the fact that he turned his back on his friend when his friend most needed him, that he just couldn't speak anymore? He couldn't?
I think, again, Blair is so passive that was probably equal to what happened to Conrad, where Conrad's snapping point made him lash out. Blair's made him retreat. It's almost like the opposite of what they do to cope. You know, Conrad hides inside of himself, and Blair ignores,
goes outside of himself.
Yeah, ignores everything around him. But when they finally get pushed to the point where things can't go back to the way they were, they both project exactly the opposite of what they were doing. Again, people are mirrors. So it's almost like that. In a way, I think Blair took that as he's the same as me, instead of he is the opposite of what I am. Mm-hmm. Because when you look into a mirror, it's an inverted image.
Yeah.
It's not you.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
That's a super good point. He's, like, fundamentally misunderstanding what a fucking mirror is to begin with. So, like, and that goes back to, again, what an unreliable narrator he is. Like, you have to believe what he's saying by nature of that's the only angle that we're getting, right? And a lot of the stuff is backed up by other witnesses. But at the end of the day, like, he's still super flawed. So it's like, you have to look outside of it as a narrative as like, okay, this isn't, like, what he's saying isn't what happened, it's what he thinks happened and what he remembers happened and how he chooses to remember it. Because he talks in the beginning about how language encodes memory and, you know, all that stuff. And, like, he's not the best person for that job anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's exactly it. When you have someone basically saying, hey, this is exactly what happened, but also they give you clear examples of them falsifying realities, You know, like,
Yeah.
how could you ever believe what they're saying? On some level, I know there is a bit of truth to what Blair says. Anytime he brings up how Conrad felt, or just feelings in general, it's really got to take it with a massive grain of salt, because it's all him.
Yeah. And it sometimes just fucking completely contradicts itself to what reality is, because, like, you know, Blair had talked himself into thinking that Conrad was feeling the pleasures of melancholy along with Blair, you know, while he was on his
when
date.
he was in the movie theater, he says, I wonder if he's having this feeling too. And that's like,
how the fuck could he have?
Yeah.
He was
In
on
what
his
way?
knees crying. You know he was in the bathroom cutting himself. Hello? Wow, how could you even for a minute think he was finding pleasure? Because he was alone, playing a video game.
Yeah.
Alone. Which is not what he needed at that moment in time.
Yeah.
And he wasn't deriving in much pleasure, if at all any, from playing in Toronto. And everyone in that fucking arcade knew it. And when he started to get more and more upset, more violent, swearing more, yelling more, shaking the arcade cabinet, people were like, okay, do we need to step in? The pinball wizard, Dimitri was his name. I looked it up. He went over and he was like, oh shit, we're like gonna have to intervene. And at this point, someone tears out of the arcade and goes to get security. And that's when the security guard from earlier, Wes Barker. You know, this guy comes to...
Keagan doesn't enjoy...
Wes Barker is kind of he's the hammiest part of this this podcast. He's not terrible, but he is where... feels really scripted.
Yeah.
He does his best, God bless him.
He does. I feel like, yeah, I always said maybe he was like the writer and he wanted a voice line or something, because, I mean, no offense to that guy, he really does do his best. And his character is pretty important.
Yeah.
For sure.
And there are, like, when he gets into it and sort of, I guess, the audio quality, like, drones out because I'm into the story, you can get into his bits. I really like how also all the names in this are, like, they're real names, but they feel fake.
Yeah.
Like Blair Van Auken. What's Conrad?
Conrad
Cliff. Even the podcast interviewer, Celia Maddox.
Celia Maddox feels like a 5 o'clock news person.
Yeah.
From like 1980, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Exactly. It's like they're such real fake names. I love it.
Oh, it's true. So somebody goes tearing out of the arcade, gets the security guard. He's like, well, this guy's closer. I'll radio him, but he still ends up getting there first. But he gets there too late. And back at the arcade, Dimitri, the pinball guy, you know, and there's other witnesses inside too. Conrad eventually is able to knock the arcade cabinet over and it shatters. It breaks. There's glass everywhere. The shit's sparking. But just past the arcade cabinet where it had fallen over is nothing more than a trap door.
He found the trap door. And I think that's where we should leave it this week.
Yeah, I think that is. We got some dead space to
fill,
to edit out for sure. But so yeah, that's episodes 1 through 3. We kind of talked about podcast Mallwalk. You can find it anywhere you can find podcasts. It's on YouTube as well. I highly recommend that y'all listen to this, because as much as we're loving talking about it, there's nothing better than listening to it yourself.
It's so super intense, and I mean, you just find yourself, like, when I started listening to it, I took it to Sydney and I was like, you just have to listen. You have to listen to just like the first 2 minutes. And she did and was like, oh my God, I need to listen to it. And
it picks up speed. So it starts much like their Mallwalk starts.
Yeah.
Kind of moving, like they're standing in one place while the world is moving around, and it picks up speed, and then it's fucking balls to the wall. Yeah. And it's devastating.
And it sucks you in, and like I said, I cried. It's extremely emotional. You feel all sorts of things, and like Keagan said, you know, it puts a name to those feelings that you have. A lot of people that suffer with depression and stuff, and the description of them, it just makes it hits you right in the gut. I can't explain it. It's just an amazing podcast, and they should do more.
Super talented people behind this. I will be watching their career with interest.
Yeah, I've had a few email communications with them.
What?
Really?
Yeah.
This is new.
Just
You
dropping
tell
this
us
fucking
this.
bomb on us.
Well, I like this stuff. I mean, there was like the radio station they use for the name that used to be real. So I would just like send the little Easter eggs and stuff that I found in there to them, and they would respond. And I told them, like, please, like, you guys aren't, have a team name, you aren't taking credit as a specific artist. Like, if you do anything, like, email me.
Yeah, that's awesome. Maybe after we're done editing and we're not embarrassed by what the product is, we can send it to them. Because they are definitely leagues above us where we are right now.
For sure.
Very
I bet their
talented
microphone's not in a box with a pillow. And we're all three using one mic right now.
But
we're getting there sooner or later.
Next episode we will be continuing right at the trapdoor.
Yeah.
And we will follow it to the end. And we are so excited to continue talking about this. This will be sticking with me for my entire life, I swear to God. It's so good.
Yeah. No, it's great.
It's one of the best pieces of media I've experienced in a while. It's really good.
It is.
So, today the pod, tomorrow the world. My name is Sydney Rebecca.
And I'm Rebecca Snow.
And we're the Becks.
And that was Keagan.
I had it.